and that we as a people have a hope that we're going to overcome and recover from what has happened. And that, again, part of those who've been successful of some of the atrocities that have been done to Native Americans is that they've transcended themselves by identifying with their tribe, which has really been an empowering experience, that even though individually they may feel helpless, together there's something that we can accomplish. And then I think the other one of this slide is that this helping others, that one of the things that is clear is contributing to the well-being of others is another way to build resiliency. And as a tribe, if we stick with one another, or, in terms of African Americans and the value of their family, that we're in this together, and what happens to one happens to all of us, becomes this strength. And that strength is really then, as I said, a hope for future generations that we can experience, withstand, and actually grow from these experiences, and that we don't have to be, quote, stuck in the present, meaning that we can't see the future that is positive, that's going to be better for me, my children, and those thereafter in future generations. In context of that, where we see the hope, where there's a loss of culture and the values, we see again the risk of drug use. We see the risk of children being raised in families that have lost their ability to parent, which obviously increases the risk of maltreatment. And so it is not individual. It's not just me as a person choosing a particular pathway to parent, but it really comes out of the context of a larger system of people with whom I feel safe with, my family, it's extended to the community, the culture, and that these are protective factors that augment the risk factors. And when those protective factors start breaking down, then we have a greater risk of some of those unhealthy ways to cope and things that can harm both the individual and the family. So I want to talk and switch just a little from this, and I want to talk about kind of this model from a mental health or child welfare or other human service paradigm, is that most often when we look at how we have done things traditionally, we look at the parental acts. So what did a parent do? A child comes into treatment, a child comes into the child welfare system, a child comes into the court, and there's this kind of quick to blame the parent. And so we kind of look at this parent and say, what did he or she do? And what do they have to do differently? And we give them a diagnosis, borderline, a variety of personality disorders, certainly bipolar, these kind of deficit models that look at psychopathology. So we're seeing a parental act and we're giving a label to a parent through the DSM process. But what we lose in that is the recognition, and you see it at the bottom of your screen, parental trauma. So what does that parent bring to that act that may have happened to him or her? Sandra Bloom, the founder of Sanctuary, a trauma-informed organizational model, talks about asking the question, what happened to you, not why did you do something? And so when we look at parental acts, we're saying, okay, where did this come from? Why did you do this to your child? And we really need to think about this from a trauma-informed model to say, what could be there in that parent's history that precipitated that act out of a, quote, fight-flight response or a reenactment from their own trauma. And then the second part of this that's on the bottom, the picture of the child circle, is we have rarely looked at, well, so what's the traumatic impact to the child? There's a parental act, the physical safety is at risk, there's a diagnosis for the parent, but now what's the consequence to the child about his or her developmental process? Again, meaning both neurobiological as well as mental health. So what we'd like to do is think of a new model so that we're really trying to do this. We're really saying, how do we look at parental acts through a parental trauma perspective. And this is where we talk about intergenerational trauma, where it happened to that parent who then reenacts on their child, and that child then is at risk to reenact on their child when they become a parent. So that what we're really trying to do is get to the root. And you'll see in a few slides about how the prevalence of intergenerational trauma really continues oftentimes the cycle of abuse, neglect, and subsequent traumatization. Unless we begin to say, so what is the root? How do we get at parent trauma? So that we see parental acts in that context rather than isolated from their history, they become a part of that history. And in order to address the future, we have to address the parental trauma. And in any family, we have to address what? The child's unresolved trauma. Because the child internalizes what has happened to him or her. And this is what we know in situations of oftentimes abuse, neglect, and maltreatment, is the child then is impacted, and the impact is what stays with the child. The maltreatment may be over, but the impact is that ongoing internal wound that keeps getting larger and larger and keeps distorting more and more of their future reality. And some of the things that happens are that what? Children blame themselves. If I had been different, this wouldn't have happened. But what happens is they take that to their own parenting, and it begins to be projected onto their children. So how do we look at this model from a trauma perspective of really addressing the parental trauma to prevent this intergenerational trauma from continuing? So if you look at this next slide, it really looks at prevalence. So what are the statistics? What are the numbers that we can really begin to think about how prevalent is this? So in the first green column there, we see 28% of male children had a caregiver with DV exposure. So that what that's saying to us is that the parent at that particular time was likely being traumatized by them being a victim themselves of domestic violence. I think this one right here of 91.6% of mothers receiving preventive services experienced at least one traumatic event in their life. So in other words, they're bringing what has happened to them to their own parenting. And then the last one, a majority of the mothers coping with combined effects of their own early trauma, substance abuse, and mental health conditions. So we're really having to understand this from an ecological viewpoint. It's not linear in the sense of, well, you know better, don't do that. It's much more ecological, where there's a reciprocal interaction that I bring my history, that history reenacts on my child impacts me, I then react to him or her. And if there is trauma there, there's a vulnerability that that reaction may not be healthy, that it's at risk of being reactive and putting the parent into a flight-fight experience. So prevalence, we wanted to talk about some more research that's been done about the prevalence, meaning if I am maltreated as a child, what's the likelihood that I might maltreat my child? But also beyond maltreatment, which is a proxy a lot for trauma, is if I was traumatized, how might that impact my parenting? Because we have to remember, maltreatment isn't always traumatizing. I think that it's very significant that a child is maltreated, but trauma does not necessarily have to be experienced depending on the non-offending's parent support, depending on the community support, depending on some resources that that child has. So just because maltreatment happens does not necessarily mean there's trauma, although it is a good proxy that it's likely that that could. So if we're looking at prevalence, you can see these three bullets. That the first one, the majority of clients served in mental health are survivors of trauma. We have a contract with the state community mental health, which is now under the Department of Health and Human Services, but they will tell us that approximately 80 to 85% of all the kids they see are what? Are kids who have been traumatized in some way, shape, or form, which is very different than saying that they just have a mental health diagnosis of ADD or opposition defiant disorder or conduct disorder or mood disorder, but that they have been traumatized. And so it's really important when we look at this that even as adults, the adults bring that ongoing experience of trauma that usually is unresolved. And by unresolved, I mean it's an experience where I keep blaming myself. It keeps affecting my perception of danger in the community. And it really disempowers me. It feels like no matter what I do, something bad is going to happen to me. And why should I keep trying? So it really affects motivation and certainly can lead to depression. So the second bullet here, 90% of homeless mothers report severe physical abuse during their lifetime. And I think, again, what we also know is that once a child has experienced trauma, their vulnerability to experience that again increases significantly. And so it happened once, it happened twice. As we move through and they get into adulthood, it really creates vulnerability that they themselves, as an adult now, will be traumatized by some kind of physical or sexual assault. And this is really important because it's not static. It just doesn't stay. It happened once and therefore it's not likely to happen again. But the more a traumatic event is experienced by someone, the more vulnerability they are to have that happen again. We have a study going on of trauma screening of child welfare children who are either in child protective services or foster care, and currently the average number of different types of trauma is 5 different types. Now, that doesn't mean how many each one happened, but it means that 5 different types. So if they each happen 3 times, that's already 15 traumatic events. And I think this is really important because it's cumulative, and that's what we call complex trauma. But as we're talking about intergenerational trauma, if all these things have happened to me and I'm bringing these into my parenthood, this is where, again, we have risk factors like homelessness and substance abuse that really undermine their ability to be successful in our society because of this ongoing intrusion from the past unresolved trauma. And then this one I think is very important, that 75% of women and men in substance abuse report a trauma history. This comes from SAMHSA. And this was bore out in a study we did at our trauma center at CTAC, that we looked at mothers in a drug court and looked at their history, and we found that 95% of all the mothers in history had had a significant history of child sexual abuse. And so now what? This intergenerational, they're bringing their coping, which is substance abuse, to their children, which ultimately we know can end up in removal or certainly harm to the kids, if not removal. And this is where, if it's not addressed, it begins to take shape in the next generation. And then this is, I think, another one that we talk about sexual abuse, that mothers who had early sexual abuse led to an aggressive style of their own parenting. And so, again, how is that affecting their experience of their child? Not in a way that it's intentional, but in a way that's oftentimes unconscious. And this is in terms of thinking about this, that my own experiences is rarely, if ever, have I met a parent, I've worked with thousands of parents, whoever didn't really love their kid. They just didn't know how to show it, and or that trauma had so distorted their experience of relationship that they were reenacting on their child and not even aware of that. So this is one with sexual abuse that's important. The other one of this that I think is critical is that among the fathers, it oftentimes led, if they were sexually abused, a rejection of any parenting practices, so that they were not likely to remain in the home, that they were not likely to be able to be responsive to their kids. And so this really undermines any familial unit when you have a father who can't participate, not because he doesn't want to, but because of what's happened to him. A couple more stats. As you can see here, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men before they're 18 have experienced some type of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. 80% of female offenders with a mental illness have been physically or sexually abused in the past. And then 50% of women in substance abuse. And this is less than the one I talked about. 95% of the study that we did, the women had experienced significant sexual abuse. So let's talk about this transmission. So how does this happen? So transmission between patterns between styles of abuse and physical neglect, I think are very interesting here. So in a study that was done, parents who have been neglected in their childhood are 2.6 times likely to report their own neglectful parenting behavior and twice as likely to report physically abusive parenting than those who do not. So what does that tell us? It tells us let's be aware of this. And you'll see this in a few more slides ahead, that one of the ways to be to intervene in this is to be proactive, to ask the questions. Because if we know there's a disproportionate number who have experienced their own trauma, then it is our responsibility to ask those questions as professionals, community members, to be able to begin to address that trauma.